The ridge road had been sealed since the morning of the first day, and by the second sunrise I had stopped pretending it might open on its own. Lord Draven's outriders had taken the high pass at first light, 36 mounted wolves in gray cloaks with no banner, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he had decided to take the treaty terms. He didn't want to be seen breaking them. He simply wanted us contained until the arbitration window closed and the border claim reverted to his house by default. It was the sort of move a patient man made when he had already decided that patience was a weapon. I understood the tactic. I had used it myself. Veltherin was a neutral hold, stone and ridge slate, built by the old treaty lords 2 centuries ago on the high spine between Caldris and the Eastern Territories, exactly far enough from both capitals that neither side could claim it by proximity. It was not built for comfort. Its corridors were narrow. Its arrow slits faced 4 directions. Its lower hall smelled of lamp oil and the particular cold that comes from rock that has never been fully warm. I had been here 3 times before for arbitration sessions, and I had never liked it. I liked it less now. My own guard numbered 14, the escort appropriate for a treaty session, not a siege. With me were my senior treaty reader, 2 scribes from the Chancery, and the neutral delegation from the river territories. A delegation master named Aldrich, his assistant, a cartographer, and a healer scribe whose name I had been given in the briefing notes, and then immediately filed somewhere I did not bother to retrieve. The delegation was not my concern. They were neutral parties. They had their own procedures for situations like this. My concern was the 14 men I was responsible for and the 14 lines of the treaty I was here to defend. I spent the second morning as I had spent the first, moving through the hold, checking the perimeter, reading Draven's positioning from the arrow slits, and calculating how long he was willing to sustain the blockade against what it cost him in men and fodder. He was not a reckless lord. He would not hold the road indefinitely. The arbitration window was 11 days. If I could run the clock, the claim reverted favorably regardless of whether the session concluded. He knew that. I knew that he knew that. The siege was a pressure tactic, not a true assault. No one was going to die on this ridge in all likelihood, unless the wounded man in the lower hall got worse. Guardsman Perrin had taken a fall on the first evening. His horse had shied at Draven's outrider's approach and thrown him against the gatehouse wall. His shoulder had been pulled badly out of its housing, and my senior healer had done what he could, but Perrin had spent the night in considerable pain, and by morning his fever had risen. I had been told, with the careful professional tone healers use when they want to manage a commander's expectations, that they were watching the joint carefully, and that these things sometimes settled on their own. I had translated this, as I always do, into, "We are not sure, and we would rather you not ask again until we are." My wolves were restless. This was the detail that bothered me most, if I am being honest, and I was not entirely sure why. I had brought 7 of them, not my full pack, but the 7 I traveled with, the ones I trusted in close quarters. They had been with me for years. They were not flighty animals. They did not startle at political inconveniences. But on the second night they had paced the lower hall where they slept, and on the morning of the third day when I descended to check on Perrin, I found them settled in a loose circle in the far corner of the room rather than at the threshold where they usually positioned themselves. They had moved toward something. I noted it and said nothing. I checked Perrin. His fever was lower than the night before, which surprised me, and I went back to the ridge-facing corridor to watch Draven's line and think. It was Aldrich, the delegation master, who mentioned her first. He found me in the upper corridor mid-afternoon, ostensibly to ask about water rationing, and then said, almost as an aside, that his healer scribe had apparently spent the night in the lower hall with the wounded guardsmen and had some thoughts about the shoulder if my healers were willing to hear them. "Her name is Senna," he said, and I heard the faint note in his voice that a man uses when he is mildly proud of something that has nothing to do with him. She trained under the bone setters in the river territories. She's been quiet about it, didn't want to overstep, but Perrin asked for her specifically this morning. I processed this. Asked for her. He said she showed him how to breathe through the joint last night. He slept better than he expected. I had no reason to think about this further. She was a neutral delegation member doing what a healer does in a situation where someone was injured. This was appropriate. This required nothing from me. Tell her my healers will welcome any counsel, I said, and meant it, and returned my attention to the corridor. I did not go to the lower hall again until after the evening meal. I told myself I was going to check on Perrin. This was true. I was also going to move my wolves back toward the threshold. I didn't like them clustered in the corner. It was not their usual positioning, and I preferred my animals where I expected them. This was also true. Both of these things were entirely sufficient reasons to descend to the lower hall at the 9th hour of the evening, when the lamps had been turned down to half, and the stone held its particular cold that even wool could not fully answer. What I had not accounted for was what I would find when I got there. She was sitting on the floor. Not on a stool, not on the bench along the wall, on the floor, her back against the stone, her legs tucked under her, a lamp on the flagstones beside her casting a small, warm circle of light. She had what appeared to be a piece of oiled linen across her knees, and she was working something with her hands, splinting material, I thought, or cord, some kind of preparation. She was not looking up. She was entirely absorbed. My 7 wolves were around her. Not near her, around her. Ranmer, who had not allowed a healer's hand near him since the campaign 3 years ago when one of our field surgeons had caused him significant pain during a poorly managed wound closure. Ranmer was lying with his great gray head on her knee. His eyes were half closed. His breathing was slow, and even in the way that meant he was genuinely resting, not merely tolerating a situation. The others were arranged in the loose, comfortable scatter of animals that have decided a location is safe. Drev and Salka were back to back near the wall. The 3 younger wolves, I had named them Ash, Slate, and Kel, practical names, working names, were curled in a pile to her left. The 7th Veth was sitting upright near the lamp, watching the door. Watching me. I stood in the entrance and did not move. I'm not certain how long I stood there. It was not a short time. I am a man who has, over many years, developed a considerable facility for processing unexpected information without visibly processing it. This is a useful quality in treaty rooms and in sieges, and in any situation where showing your reaction before you have finished having it is a disadvantage. I called on this quality now. I used it. It did not help as much as I would have liked. She looked up. She did not startle. That was the first thing I noticed. There was no flinch, no caught breath, no instinctive apology for being found in a position she had not been invited to occupy. She simply looked up, registered me, and waited. Her face in the lamplight was calm the way still water is calm, not because nothing was moving beneath it, but because whatever moved there moved too deep and too steadily to disturb the surface. Alpha King, she said. Her voice was quiet, not small quiet. There is a difference. Small voices shrink from the space they occupy. Hers simply did not need more room than it had. Senna, I said. Something moved across her expression, not quite surprise. Something more like recognition, which made no sense, because we had not spoken before, and I was not certain I had ever been within 10 feet of her in the 2.5 days of this siege. Ranmer had not lifted his head. I should move, she said. I didn't mean to stay this long. I came down to check on Perrin's fever and then, a pause. She looked at the wolves, and the look on her face when she did was not the careful brightness of someone trying to appear comfortable with animals they were actually wary of. It was the look of someone who had simply found themselves somewhere unexpected and had not thought to leave. They didn't seem to mind, she finished. They don't let anyone near them, I said. It came out more bluntly than I intended. She did not seem to take it as criticism. I noticed that, she said. When I first came down, the gray one, she meant Ranmer. He was watching Perrin from the corner and I thought he looked uncomfortable. I didn't try to approach him. I just sat down on this side of the room and worked on the splinting cord, and after a while he came over. She said this as if it were a perfectly ordinary account of events, as if wolves that had not allowed a strange hand near them in 7 years simply came over to rest their heads on someone's knee on a whim, when they felt like it, when the light was right and the evening was quiet. My wolf, the part of me that is older than my name and more honest than my face, had gone very still. Not still like held breath, still like a room after a sound you realize you've been waiting to hear. I became aware that I had taken several steps into the lower hall without deciding to. I was standing closer to her than I had intended. In the lamplight, with Ranmer's head on her knee and Veth watching me from beside the lamp with an expression I could not quite read on a wolf's face. In that light, something I had been carrying for 7 years shifted on its axis, and I did not have a name for what it moved toward. "How is Perrin's shoulder?" I asked, because I needed to say something that was not the thing I was actually thinking, and this was a question I had actually come here to ask. "Better," she said it simply. "The fever is down because the joint is tracking better. When it doesn't sit right, it causes the body to fight itself. I worked with him this afternoon on the positioning." Your healer Morse was very generous about explaining what they'd tried. Morse said you knew bone setting. I know what I was trained in. The river territories use different methods than the highland holds for joint injuries. It's the climate, I think, the way the cold affects the tissue. I didn't want to overstep. You reset his shoulder. I helped him find the position where his body could do it. He was fighting the pain so hard that the muscles around the joint couldn't release. Once they released, the joint settled. She said this with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has simply done a thing and is explaining how it works, without investment in whether I found it impressive. I had been in enough rooms with people trying to appear capable to recognize what actual capability looked like. It did not announce itself. "You've been doing this all day," I said. "Perrin, my wolves, what else?" She looked at me steadily. "Aldrich's assistant has a headache that hasn't lifted in 2 days. She gets them when the air pressure changes, and ridge holds have their own particular pressure. I've been managing it. The cartographer has a tendency to write in bad light and his eyes are strained. I showed him the lamp positioning. The guardsman at the east arrow slit has been on his feet for 12 hours because you're short-handed and someone had to cover it, and his ankles are swelling." "That's Jared." "Yes." I was quiet for a moment. "You've been moving through the hold." "I'm a healer scribe," she said. "I keep records and I notice when people aren't well. It seemed useful to do both." A pause. "I didn't want to bother you with it. You have the siege to manage." I did not say, "You should have told me," because I looked at her in the lamplight with Ranmer breathing slow and even against her knee, and I understood that she had made a decision that I would not have reversed if I'd known about it, and she had made it correctly, and the reason she had not brought it to me was not because she was hiding anything. It was because she was the kind of person who simply handles things that need handling and doesn't require an audience for it. I had met very few people like that in my life. I sat down. Not in the manner of a king choosing a chair. There was no chair. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall on the other side of the lamp, because it was the appropriate thing to do in a room where someone was already sitting on the floor, and you intended to continue a conversation, and I was not accustomed to finding the appropriate thing to do simultaneously surprising and obvious. Ranmer opened one eye, regarded me, and closed it again. "Tell me about the river territories," I said. She told me. She spoke about the bone-setting tradition the way a person speaks about something they learned young and loved without making it a performance of loving it, with the particular fluency of someone whose knowledge has been used often enough to settle into their bones. She told me about the 3-season training, the difference between the highland and lowland approaches to joint trauma, the specific challenge of siege injuries as opposed to battle injuries, the way bodies under sustained stress develop different patterns of collapse than bodies under acute shock. She told me about a teacher she had admired who had a theory about the relationship between the breath and the muscle that most of the established healers thought was eccentric, and that she had watched prove itself right too many times to doubt. I listened. This sounds simple. It was not simple. I am a man who listens as a professional practice, in treaty rooms, in war councils, in arbitration sessions that go 12 and 14 hours. I have trained myself to hear what people are actually saying rather than what they think they are saying, to catch the hesitations and the overemphases, to track the gap between the argument being made and the argument being withheld. Listening to her was different. She was not negotiating. She was not performing. She was simply talking to me in the way that people talk when they are not particularly trying to impress the person they're talking to and are therefore, unintentionally, more interesting than they have ever been in their lives. At some point, Ash got up from the pile of younger wolves and walked over to me and lay down against my leg. I looked down at this and looked back up. Senna was watching with something in her expression that might have been a smile, if a smile could be quiet enough to exist only in the eyes. "He's been wanting to do that for an hour," she said. "I think he's been waiting for you." I did not say, "So have I," because it would have been too much and too soon, and said in a siege hold on a cold ridge floor, it would have required explanation. I did not yet have the right words for. Instead I said, "What do the wolves in the river territories look like?" And she told me about that too. The third day of the siege was the day I understood that Draven was going to withdraw. I had been watching his line since the second morning, and the mathematics of the blockade had been moving steadily toward a conclusion that was not in his favor. The treaty arbitration window was 11 days. We were 3 days in. He needed either to escalate, which would break the treaty openly and cost him the border claim entirely, or to hold the road for 8 more days on dwindling fodder and men who had not been resupplied since before the pass. His eastern supply route was 2 days' ride. He had not, as far as I could see from the arrow slits, received a resupply since the morning of the first day. He was bluffing. I had known he was probably bluffing from the beginning. But there is knowing something, and there is seeing its confirmation take shape, in the way the outriders at the far end of the ridge had started to reposition their horses, and these are not the same knowledge, and only one of them allows you to act. I told my treaty reader, Aldrich and Jarrett, who had recovered from his ankle swelling overnight, and was back at his post with a visible gratitude that I suspected had less to do with my management of the situation than with whatever Senna had applied to his joints the previous evening. I did not tell Senna immediately, and I examined this decision when I noticed it. I had spent most of the third day aware of where she was in the hold. This was not surveillance. I was not following her, not tracking her movements in any way that imposed on her. She moved freely through the corridors, between the upper rooms and the lower hall, past the arrow slits where the guards were posted. She always had something in her hands, the healer's case, the oiled linen, the cord, a cup of something she was apparently producing from a kit she had brought in her pack. I would see her in a corridor, and she would acknowledge me with a nod and continue to wherever she was going, and I would continue in whatever direction I had been heading, and then I would find myself, 10 minutes later, in a position where I could see the door she had entered. This was not surveillance, but it was not nothing. My wolf had not settled since the night before, not in the restless, pacing way of the second night, the opposite. My wolf was quiet in the way of an animal that has finally oriented towards something it has been looking for without knowing it was looking for it, and is now simply pointed, the way a tracking wolf points, patient and certain and not about to look away. I am a king. I have been Alpha King of Cauldres for 14 years. I have sat through treaty negotiations that lasted 11 days without sleeping for more than 3 hours at a stretch. I have held a battle line when the line wanted badly to break. I have made decisions in the span of a breath that I then had to live with for years. I know what it is to have my attention given over completely to something that matters, because I have done it many times. I know the particular quality of that focus, the way it narrows everything else, not because everything else has ceased to exist, but because the thing that matters has taken up all available space. I had not expected to experience it in a siege hold over a healer scribe from the river territories. I had not expected it at all. I had not expected it in 7 years, and I had not been, I think, consciously expecting it ever again. My wolves had stopped accepting anyone near them 7 years ago, and I had told myself, eventually, that this simply meant the bond was not a thing that would happen for me, and I had managed the grief of this until it had become something that only ached on certain nights, which is the best you can do with some kinds of loss. Senna moved through the hold with her healer's case and her quiet voice, and my 7 wolves, who had been alone with me for 7 years, had arranged themselves around her on the floor of the lower hall like they had been waiting. At the 4th hour of the afternoon, I found her in the narrow corridor outside the east arrow slit. She was standing at the slit looking out, not the way people look through arrow slits at a siege, not with fear or calculation or the performance of calm, with the particular focused stillness of someone reading something in the landscape outside. She had one hand on the cold stone of the slit's edge, and she was simply looking. "Draven's line is moving," she said without turning. I stopped. "You can see that from this angle. The horses on the left have been repositioning for 2 hours. She stepped back from the slit to give me the angle. "That cluster near the old cairn, they were facing toward the hold this morning. They're facing the ridge road now." I looked. She was right. "How long have you been watching his line?" "Since this morning." A pause. "I'm a healer scribe. I keep records. I notice patterns." She said this not as a deflection but as a simple statement of how she works. I wasn't sure if it was significant. I didn't want to. "Tell me things you think are significant," I said. "Please." She looked at me then, and I held the look, and something passed between us in that narrow corridor with the cold air coming through the slit and Draven's repositioning horses outside that I could not have named in a treaty room and would not have tried. It was not a dramatic thing. It was simply the look of 2 people who have recognized something about each other and are deciding what to do with it. "All right," she said, and turned back toward the lower hall. Draven's withdrawal began before dawn. I was at the east arrow slit when the first of his outriders moved back from the high pass, and I watched them go in the particular cold that comes in the hour before light, when the ridge holds its darkest temperature and the horses breathe steam into the dark. It was orderly, quiet, unhurried. He was not fleeing. He was simply concluding a calculation that had come out wrong and adjusting accordingly, the way a patient man adjusts when patience has run its expected course without producing the expected result. I had been in position since the 3rd hour of the morning. I had slept for perhaps 2 hours sometime around midnight, which was more than I had slept on either of the previous nights, and I did not examine the reason for this too carefully. Senna had returned to the upper rooms sometime after the 10th hour of the evening before. My wolves had followed her to the bottom of the stairs, and then returned to the lower hall and slept in a way they had not slept, calm, settled, without pacing, since the beginning of the siege. Veth had sat at the bottom of the stairs for a while longer. I had briefly understood this. By the time the sun was fully over the ridge, the road was clear, and by the time Aldrich had confirmed the withdrawal through the gate slits and my guard had done a perimeter check, the hold was as free as it had been 3 days ago. Draven had left nothing. No message, no banner, no formal acknowledgement of the retreat, which was itself a message, and the message was, this didn't happen. He would not reference it in the arbitration. He would simply be absent from the session that he had tried to prevent by other means, and the terms of the treaty would proceed without him, which was, in the language of border claims, equivalent to conceding the point. I had won. Without a battle, without a word spoken to Draven directly, without anything more than 11 days of patience I had been prepared to deploy, and 3 days of a siege I had not been prepared for in any of the ways that mattered. Aldrich was already organizing the delegation's departure. This was the appropriate next step. They were neutral parties. The session was effectively complete given Draven's withdrawal, and there was no reason to remain in a ridge hold that was cold and under-resourced when the river territories were 2 days' ride in favorable weather. His assistant was packing. The cartographer had his materials bundled. The healer scribe. I became aware that I was standing in the upper corridor outside the room I knew was theirs, and that I had arrived here without a clear account of when I had decided to come. Senna was inside. The door was open. She was packing methodically, the healer's case laid open on the bed with its contents arranged in the order she would need to close it, which was, I understood without being told, the reverse of the order she would need to open it. She was a person who thought about the sequence of things. She was a person who did things in the order that made the next thing easier. I had been watching her work for 3 days, and I knew this about her as well as I knew anything. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway. She did not look surprised to see me there. I was not sure if this was because she had been expecting me, or because she was the kind of person who was not often surprised by things. "The road is clear," I said. "I know." She placed a piece of linen into the case. "Aldrich says we'll leave within the hour." "Yes." A pause. She continued packing. I continued standing in the doorway with the particular sensation of a man who has many things to say and has not yet identified which of them should be first. "You reset Perrin's shoulder," I said. "You managed Jarrett's swelling and Downless headache and the cartographer's eyes. You watched Draven's line from the east slit, and you told me what you saw when you thought it was significant. You spent 2 nights on the floor of the lower hall with 7 wolves that don't accept anyone near them." She had stopped packing. She was watching me with the still, deep quality that I had first noticed in the lamplight and that I had been noticing. I now admitted to myself, in every corridor and at every door and through every arrow-slit angle for 3 days. "You did all of that," I said, "without asking for acknowledgement or authority or anything from me. You just did what needed doing and then continued to the next thing." "There were things that needed doing," she said. The tone was not modest in the way of people who are waiting to be contradicted. It was simply the tone of someone who does not understand why this is remarkable. "Senna, Alpha King." I stepped into the room. Not far, 2 steps, enough to be inside the threshold, not so far that the space between us was less than the space between us ought to be when I had not yet said the thing I needed to say. She watched me. She did not step back. She did not perform steadiness, the way people perform it when they are in the presence of someone they want to appear unaffected by. She simply was steady, in the way that people are steady when they have been steady their whole lives and do not think of it as an achievement. "My wolves," I said. "They haven't accepted anyone near them in 7 years. Not a healer, not a guardsman, not a diplomat, not anyone I have brought to them in 7 years of trying. And they have spent the last 2 nights arranged around you on the floor of the lower hall, like they were waiting for you to come home." Something moved in her expression. It was not surprise. It was the look of someone who has been holding a thought carefully and is now watching it confirmed. "I know what that means," I said. "I have been Alpha King for 14 years. I know what it means when my wolves I started again. My wolf has been still since the night I walked into the lower hall and found you, not restless still, the other kind." Senna set down the piece of linen she had been holding. "The kind that means it's found something," she said, not a question. "Yes." The morning light was coming through the narrow window of the room in a long, cold bar, and in it I could see her face clearly. The particular quality of her attention, the still depth of it, the way she looked at something with her full focus without crowding it. I was aware that she had been looking at me with that same quality of attention for 3 days, in corridors and at arrow slits, and over the lamplight on the floor of the lower hall, and that I had been noticing it without admitting what I was noticing. "I don't want you to leave with the delegation," I said. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, I could hear Aldrich's voice somewhere in the corridor, the organized sounds of departure, the efficient noise of people who are going somewhere. "That's a large thing to say," she said. "Yes." "We met 3 days ago." "Yes." "Under a siege." "Yes," I held her gaze. "And in those 3 days you managed the health of everyone in this hold, kept records, watched the enemy line, and sat on the floor of a cold lower hall with 7 wolves who have not rested like that in 7 years. And my wolf—" I paused. "I am not a man who says things like this easily. I am a man for whom the space between knowing something and saying it has always been negotiated carefully, because I have been in enough rooms where saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment cost more than silence. But I was standing in a room in a cold ridge hold on the morning after a siege, and the delegation was packing, and I was running out of time to negotiate the space. My wolf does not make mistakes about this," I said. "In 14 years, it has not been wrong about anything it was certain of, and it has never been certain of anything the way it is certain of you." The long bar of morning light lay across the floor between us. "I'm a healer scribe," she said, "from the river territories. I'm attached to the delegation because Aldrich needed someone with bone-setting training and I needed the work. I have a rented room in the lower city and a teacher I write to every week and a very ordinary life." "I know," I said. "I don't require your life to be extraordinary. I require it to be yours." She looked at me. "I'm asking you to stay," I said. "Not ordering it, I want to be clear about that. I am not the lord of this hold and you are not under my authority, and even if you were, this is not a thing I would order. I am asking. You can walk out that gate with the delegation, and I will send word to Aldrich that I am grateful for his cooperation, and I will ride back to Caldris, and this will be the thing that happened during the siege. The thing I nearly let walk away because I didn't say it in time." A pause. "Or you can stay," I said, "and I will send word to your kin today, properly with the full form of the asking everything it should be, and you will have time, as much time as you need, to decide what staying means. I will not rush you, I will not press, but I am asking you not to get in that carriage." Senna was very still. Not frozen, present, in the way she was always present, the way that had kept drawing my attention for 3 days without my understanding what it was drawing my attention toward. "Your wolves," she said, "the gray one, Ranmer." "Yes." "He put his head on my knee," she said, "and I wasn't trying to make him. I was just sitting there. I thought he'd move away when he'd had enough. He didn't move away." "No," I said, "he didn't." "I kept thinking I should get up and go back to the upper rooms," she said, "and then I kept not going." "Yes." She looked down at the healer's case laid out on the bed, at the contents arranged in their careful order, at the piece of linen she had been holding when I walked in. "I have to tell Aldrich," she said. "I'll come with you," I said. Aldrich was in the upper corridor with his assistant and the cartographer, and he looked at us, at me, and then at Senna, and then at me again, with the expression of a man who is running diplomatic calculations at speed and has arrived, somewhat ahead of the conversation, at a conclusion he had not expected this morning. "Master Aldrich," I said, "I owe you and your delegation my gratitude for your conduct during the siege. You were steady, cooperative, and professionally exemplary, and I will say as much to the River Territories Council when the treaty session concludes." Aldrich inclined his head. "Alpha King." "I also want to tell you," I said, "that I am asking your healer scribe to remain at Veltharen rather than traveling back with the delegation." Aldrich looked at Senna. Senna was looking at the middle distance with the particular expression of someone who is very composed and would prefer, for the moment, not to be looked at. "She is my fated mate," I said. It was the first time I had said it out loud in those words, and I was aware that this was not the most private or the most carefully orchestrated setting in which to say them. A corridor in a siege hold with 3 delegation members and a cartographer and 2 of my guards in peripheral earshot. But I had run out of patience for orchestration. My wolves have confirmed it. I will be sending formal word to her kin today, through proper channels, in the full form of the asking. I wanted you to know so that her absence from your party is explained and accounted for." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man. I had observed this over 3 days. He processed things before he responded to them, and what he said when he did respond was almost always more measured than whatever he was thinking. "Senna," he said, "is this your wish?" Senna had been looking at the middle distance. She looked at Aldrich. "Yes," she said. Her voice was the same, quiet, not small, not performing anything. "It is." Aldrich looked at me. He had the look of a man who had many things he could say and was choosing among them rapidly. "She is one of the best healers I have traveled with," he said finally. "You should know that." "I am beginning to understand it," I said. He extended his hand and I took it. "The river territories will expect a formal notification," he said. "They will have it by the end of the week." He nodded. He looked at Senna one more time, the brief, complete look of a man who has worked alongside someone and is satisfied with how things have turned out for them, even if it was not the outcome he had expected. And then he returned to the business of departure with the efficiency I had come to recognize as his particular quality. The carriage left within the hour. The courtyard of Veltharen faced east, and when the gates opened to let the delegation through, the morning light came in at an angle that fell across the ridge slate in long, flat bars, the same cold, clear light that had been coming through the window of the upper room an hour before. I stood in the gateway and watched the carriage move down the ridge road, which was clear and open and entirely itself again, as if the last 3 days had been a held breath now released. Senna was standing beside me. Not close enough that it required anything of either of us, close enough that I could have taken one step and been beside her properly. She was watching the carriage go with an expression I could not quite read and did not try to, because I understood that she was in the middle of something I should not intrude on, the particular moment of a person who has made a choice and is watching the version of their life they did not choose move away down a road. I waited. The carriage turned at the first bend of the ridge road and went out of sight. She was quiet for a moment after it disappeared. "I have never done anything like this in my life," she said. "I believe you," I said. "I met you 3 days ago." "Yes, under a siege. You keep mentioning that." "It seems relevant." She was quiet for another moment. Then very slightly her mouth curved. I had not seen her smile yet, not fully. She had had the almost smile in the lamplight on the first night and the not quite smile in the corridor by the arrow slit, and this was something in between, something beginning. "Your wolves are going to be insufferable about this," she said. I looked back toward the lower hall where I could see, through the gate arch, the dim suggestion of Ranmer's shape in the interior shadows, watching. "They've been insufferable about it since the first night," I said. "They were simply waiting for me to catch up." She laughed. It was a small laugh, a surprised one, the laugh of someone who had not expected to laugh in the middle of the morning of the rest of their life. It was, I thought, the best sound I had heard in 7 years, and I had heard it, finally, in a cold courtyard on a ridge at the eastern end of my territory after a siege that I had won by waiting, and a bond that had found me the same way. She turned and looked at me. Full on, in the morning light, the way she looked at things she was paying attention to completely, without hedging, without the performance of being looked at. "Tell me about Caldris," she said. So I did. I told her about the mountains that held the northern end, where the snow came early and stayed long, and the valleys between them where the pack territories ran wide, and the wolves moved through the deep winter like gray water through stone. I told her about the great hall that was warmer than Veltherin, which I admitted was not a high bar, but was genuinely warm in the way of a place that has been lived in for generations and holds the warmth of all those years in its stones. I told her about the healers there, 3 of them, good ones, who would, I thought, very much want to hear about the river territory's approach to joint injuries. I told her about the pack, which was large and complicated and entirely capable of being overwhelming in the first week if you didn't know that the right strategy was to simply go about your business and let them come to you on their own schedule, which they would. She listened the way she always listened, with her full attention, which was not effortful attention but simply the way she was. She asked questions. Good ones, specific, the kind that told me she was building a real picture rather than collecting impressions. She asked about the pack's seasonal patterns, about how the Northern Territories handled the treaty calendar, about whether the Great Hall's healers worked within a particular school or had developed their own approach. We walked back into the hold while I was answering the last of these, and Ranmer came to meet us at the inner door, and he walked between us down the corridor toward the lower hall, and if he had a thought about this development, he kept it to himself with the dignity I had always respected in him and also, I was now aware, somewhat taken for granted. The hold was quieter without the delegation. My 14 guards were beginning the post-siege accounting, inventory, perimeter inspection, the formal record of the siege days that would go back to Caldris with my report. I would need to write that report. I would need to send the formal words to Senna's kin. I would need to arrange a proper escort back to Caldris, because I was not going to bring my fated mate back to my pack in a siege carriage with a guard of 14, which was entirely the wrong number for what this was. There was a great deal to do. For the first time in 3 days, for the first time in, I thought, considerably longer than 3 days, I found that I did not mind what was in front of me. Senna had stopped at the entrance to the lower hall. She was looking in at the space she had occupied for 2 nights, the flagstones, the lamp position, the corner where the wolves had slept. It was a cold room. It was not a comfortable room. It was not the place a person would choose to spend 2 nights if they had been given a choice, and she had been given a choice, and she had kept returning. "I'll need to write to my teacher," she said. "She's going to have questions." I imagine so. She's very practical. She'll want to understand the arrangement before she has a reaction to it. "I would be glad to explain it to her myself," I said, "in whatever form is appropriate." Senna looked at me over her shoulder. She's 73, and she has very strong opinions about the political implications of fated mate bonds in cross-territorial contexts. "Then we will have a great deal to talk about," I said. She turned back to the lower hall. The light from the arrow slit was coming in at an angle now, mid-morning, touching the flagstones in a way that made them look almost warm. Ranmer had gone to his usual spot near the far wall and was settling in with the elaborate care of a wolf who has done a great deal of emotional labor and considers a rest well earned. "It's a cold room," she said. "Yes. Caldris is warmer. I told you it was." She considered this for a moment, the way she considered things, not quickly but not slowly either, with the appropriate amount of time, no more. "All right," she said, and then she turned and walked back into the corridor, toward the business of the day, and I walked beside her, and behind us Ranmer raised his great gray head and put it back down, satisfied. The formal words went to her kin that evening, carried by the fastest rider I had available, which was not as fast as I would have liked given that I had come to the Ridge Hold with a treaty escort rather than a courier's team, but it was what I had. The letter was written in the proper form, complete, leaving nothing unstated, making the asking clear in every particular. I am a man who has spent 14 years in treaty rooms. I know how to write a document that says exactly what it means." Her kin's answer came back before we left Veltherin. They said yes, and they said it simply, and the simplicity of it told me everything I needed to know about what they had hoped for her. We rode back to Caldris in 4 days, with a full escort I had arranged from the nearest Caldris garrison, and the weather held, and the wolves ran alongside the road as they always do when I travel, which is a thing I have never thought to explain to anyone because I have always traveled with people who already understood it. Senna watched them for the first hour, and then she stopped watching them as a separate thing and simply rode, which is also how she had been in the hold, arriving at ease not as an achievement but as her ordinary state. At some point during the second day of riding, Ranmer moved from his position at the back of the pack and settled into a pace alongside her horse. He did not leave that position for the rest of the journey. I noted this and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had known before I did, and he had waited, with more patience than I had given him credit for, and he had also sat at the bottom of a staircase in a cold siege hold because a woman had gone up those stairs and he hadn't quite been ready for her to be out of his sight. We had, I thought, more in common than I had previously acknowledged. Caldris came into view on the afternoon of the 4th day. I had been back from many things, over 14 years, campaigns, treaty sessions, arbitrations, the long winter councils that ran into the small hours of the morning. I had come back to Caldris after all of them with the particular feeling of a man returning to the place that is his, not comfortable exactly, not relaxed, but correctly situated, the way a stone sits in the wall it was cut for. I came back from Veltherin with Senna riding beside me, and I looked at Caldris in the afternoon light, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, correctly situated did not feel like the ceiling of the thing I could expect. The pack was at the gate. Not in formal array, they had not been notified of anything particular, because there had not been time to send proper word ahead, and also because I had wanted to do this in the right order, which meant I needed to be there. But they gathered the way packs gather when the Alpha King returns from something, a loose, informal attending presence, the kind that is not arranged but simply happens. They saw Senna. They did not bow. This was not the time for that, and she would not have wanted it. But there was a stillness that moved through them as she rode through the gate, a brief collective orientation, the way a pack orients when something important has happened that they are only now understanding. And then the stillness resolved into the particular quality of a pack that has recognized something it has been missing without knowing to name what it was missing. My treaty reader, who had been at the gate, looked at me with the expression of a man who has several things he wants to say, and has identified them all as unnecessary. "We'll need to reschedule the full arbitration session," he said. "With Draven's withdrawal, the terms revert, but the formal conclusion needs to be." "Tomorrow," I said, "all of it tomorrow." He looked from me to Senna and back. "Yes, Alpha King." Senna had dismounted. She was standing in the courtyard of Caldris with the pack around her, not watching her exactly but not watching her either, the attending awareness of wolves who are uncertain whether to approach and are reading the space carefully. She was not performing ease. She was simply standing, the healer's case at her side, looking around at the courtyard with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. Complete, specific, without judgment. Ranmer moved through the crowd and stood beside her. The pack read this, the way packs read things, not a commanded signal, just the fact of it, clear and unmistakable. And the stillness shifted into something warmer, the way the quality of a room shifts when a door opens onto the right kind of afternoon. I walked to where she was standing. "The Great Hall is through that door," I said. "It is, in fact, warmer than Veltherin." "High bar," she said. I said as much. She looked at the door, she looked at me. The same full attention, the same deep steadiness, the same quality of a person who has arrived somewhere and is taking the accurate measure of it rather than the wished-for one. "All right," she said, and she walked toward the door and I walked beside her, and behind us the pack settled into itself, the way a pack settles when the thing that was missing has been found and brought home. Her teacher sent a letter 6 weeks later. It was 13 pages, written in a hand that had clearly been trained in a school with very high standards for penmanship, and it covered the political implications of fated mate bonds in cross-territorial contexts in considerable and well-organized detail. It also covered, in a section near the end that was marked by a slightly different quality of handwriting, as if it had been written at a different hour, the River Territory's formal blessing of the bond and the hope that Senna had found what she was suited for, and the notation that her place in the training lineage would be held for any student she wished to recommend, should she eventually choose to teach. Senna read it at the table in the healer's workroom she had taken over, which was already organized in the order in which things would need to be used, and which had been, I had noticed, reorganized twice in 6 weeks as she arrived at a better understanding of which order that was. She read the entire 13 pages. She read the last section twice. Then she looked up at me, across the workroom table, with the not-quite smile that I had learned by then to read correctly, the one that existed only in her eyes and meant she was more moved than she was going to say. "She wants me to write back with a complete account of the siege," she said. "She's particularly interested in how Perrin's shoulder responded to the breath release method." "Will you write it?" "I've already started." I looked at her across the table, at the organized workroom, at the healer's case in its position at the far wall, at the lamp she had positioned. I had watched her position it at the angle that gave the best working light. At the 73-year-old teacher's letter laid out flat beside her notes, and the handwriting in the last section that was slightly different from the rest. My wolf was still. Not the stillness of waiting, the other kind. The kind I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting to feel again. "Senna," I said. She looked up. "Thank you," I said, "for the third night, for not going back to the upper rooms." She considered this for a moment, in the way she considered things, with the appropriate time, and the full attention, and the particular quality that I had been watching across corridors and arrow slits and lamplit floors since the beginning of all of this. "I kept thinking I should," she said, "and then I kept thinking a little longer." "Yes," I said. "So did I." Outside, somewhere in the lower corridors, Ranmer was making his evening round, the slow, deliberate circuit of the great hall he had taken on, without instruction, from the first night, the way a wolf takes on the watch of a place it has decided belongs to it. The sound of him was familiar in a way that the sound of the hall had not been familiar before, or perhaps it was that the hall itself was different now, not in its stones or its light or the way the cold came in at the high windows, but in the particular quality of a place where someone has settled, truly settled, and the settling has made it more itself than it was. I went around the table. She looked up at me, and I sat down on the bench beside her, close enough that the space between us was the right space, not no space, but close, and I looked at the letter with the 13-page analysis of cross-territorial bond politics and the last section in the slightly different handwriting, and she went back to her notes, and outside Ranmer turned at the end of the corridor and started back. The lamp held its light. We had time now for everything.